Hi, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here with another PB&J card class, and this is one in a series of several videos featuring Penny Black's newest Scenic stamps. And the Scenic stamp that we will be creating with today is called Paradise, and this is a large cling stamp. It is so fun to work with, and in today's video I will be showing you two different techniques and styles that you can create and do with this stamp. So the first that you're looking at here is a watercolor technique. And the second here is an ink blending technique. And before we begin, I just wanted to mention I will have a full list of all the supplies I'm using in the video. The ink colors, the stamps, everything will be at the end of the video up on screen for each card. So if you want to look at them in more detail, you can just hit pause at that time. So to begin, we're going to do the ink blending technique. And I am working in my Misty Stamp Positioning tool onto smooth, and I'm stamping onto smooth white cardstock. And I'm starting here by inking my stamp using my Arteza Real Brush pens. You can use any of your water-based markers to ink directly onto your stamp. And for this ink blending technique, if you're using ink pads, you can pick any ink pad that you like. So I find I prefer the mini-sized ink pads just because it's easier to selectively apply the ink to the stamp. But you can pick whatever you like. I tend to choose by that mini size and then the colors that I like. But to start off here, I wanted to just do some sort of painterly look and get the color onto these palm trees using my markers. I'm starting with my lightest color of green first, and then I will go back in and add some darker shading using a darker marker. Now you may notice when you are putting ink onto your stamp using a marker, especially onto larger areas of a stamp, that you may see some of those brush strokes from the marker. And that is because you are actually just brushing on that ink onto the stamp using whatever brush tip that your marker has. So it's a little bit harder to get an exact even coat of color onto your stamp. And if you find that that is difficult for you, that's where you may want to start with your ink pads and then add your shading just using the markers. For these palm trees, it's really okay if they don't have an exact look to them because of the nature of that image. Here I'm just adding some blue onto the water areas of the stamp. If you get any accidentally just get a little bit of color where you don't want it, you can just wipe it off using your fingertip or just a dry paper towel. And I'll just do a couple of impressions just to darken up that color and get a nice crisp look. When you're working on your stamp, you may find it helpful to have your packaging that came with your stamp handy just for some ideas for color choices and shading. But you certainly don't have to be limited by that. This stamp has a lot of different ways that you can do the coloring for it. Here I'm doing some more realistic coloring onto the stamp. You could also just stamp this in black and do it as a silhouette with a sunset in the background. I think that would be really dynamic and really pretty. And these scenic cards are great for so many different occasions. I think this scene would be great for a thinking of you or a summer birthday. I also think it would be really fun to send someone a card in the winter time with this stamp, especially if that person is like me and really does not like winter. This might just brighten their mood and their spirits a little bit to see a nice, lovely beach scene. And here you can see I'm just adding that color onto the trunks of those trees. And it's very easy to see on this stamp where you're adding your color. What is the trunk? What is the sand? What is the top of the palm tree? Sometimes with floral stamps, it's a little bit more difficult to tell where one petal ends and the next begins. But with these scenic stamps, it's really easy to tell what you're working on, where you're putting that color. Here I'm just adding a light color for the sand. And this is really fun, and you'll see when we put our inks on top of this, to have some very light colored sand is really neat when you do a sunset scene like we're making and when you add your inks on top. And I'll mention that again when we get closer to that part. And just doing it a couple of times, like I said before, when you're putting that marker or that color on with the brush, you sometimes need a couple of different applications to get it on evenly and not make sure you didn't miss any areas. Now here I'm going to pat on just a touch of color using one of those mini archival ink pads, just giving that a little bit of an orange glow to the edges, and then even a little bit more up here onto the centers of those palm trees with some green. And that I'm using just the corner of that ink pad, sort of turning it on its side, and that lets me put just the very smallest amount of ink in the center of those palm trees. And I'll get these ones too. Now I'm going to clean off my stamp, so I'm just spraying that with water and wiping it down with a microfiber cloth. I want to be sure not to move the stamp when I'm cleaning it, and also not to move my paper. Because once that is clean and dry, that towel gets it nice and dry too, I'm going to just pat an anti-static bag over my stamping on the right hand side, and then I'm going to ink up my stamp with Versamark ink. This is just a clear sticky ink, and I will stamp this right over the top of all of that colored stamping that we did. There's a lot of detail to this stamp and it's fairly large, so I'm just going to do this a couple of times just to be 100% sure that I haven't missed any areas. And then once I've stamped that, I will remove that from my stamp positioning tool and sprinkle it with clear embossing powder, and then I will heat set that. And what that's going to do is seal in all of those areas that we've colored, and when we add our inks on top in just a minute, that embossed areas, that embossed image will resist that ink. Now I also wanted to be sure that these white areas on the trunks of the trees stayed white when we added our inks. So I'm using a Versa marker. This has that same ink that's in the Versamark ink pad, but it's just in a marker form so you can selectively add it wherever you want it. I'm just going to color on top of those trunks and then sprinkle that with the clear embossing powder and heat that to set as well. And then we will be ready to add our inks. When doing this technique, you'll want to use dye inks to do your ink blending because those will be resisted by that embossed area in the background. And to create my sunset, I'm just using a piece of scratch paper to mask off the area where the sky meets the ocean. And I'm using Wendy Vecchi Make Art blendable dye inks and also some Memento inks on this background. I'm starting by putting a light layer of yellow down, and I'm just using an ink blending tool with a foam pad. You can see I'm sort of starting on my scratch paper and working my way on. If you're worried about your scratch paper sort of wiggling around, you could use the sticky edge of post-it notes or post-it note tape, or even some like Eclipse masking paper just to go along that edge. But I find just holding the scratch paper works all right for me. And here I'm using just a circle that I've cut, holding that down and putting now some orange blossom, so a darker orange, around the edge of that circle. And this is going to give us an instant sunset to our scene. Just kind of sneaking my way around here. You'll see it does wiggle a little bit on me there, and I just realign it and finish inking at the top. And there you have your sunset. It's very easy to do, and you can see that the green of those palm trees, everything has resisted the yellow and the orange inks, and those stay in the foreground while that sunset goes to the background. Now I'm going to use just the other side of that scratch paper to mask off the bottom or the beach part of the scene, and I'm going to add the water. I'm going to use a fingertip sponge dauber for this, and this just allows me to apply the ink in this small area without having it go where I don't want it to go. So this just keeps it in the ocean area and out of the sky. I'm starting with the Garden Patina color, and then I will go in with some nautical blue Memento ink just to darken that up. I really liked that Garden Patina for a very tropical look, but with the sunset I felt like it was just a little too bright, so I did go in and darken it. But you can see right here how just by changing the different color of the water, if you did your sky a different color, you can get a totally different look to this one stamp. And again, just using that sponge dauber, starting on the scratch paper and working my way on in just a very light circular motion. And adding that in. I am leaving a little bit of white up at the top because I will go in and add some yellow there. So this is a detail ink blending tool from Ranger, and it's very small with a little sponge at the end, and that allows me to put just the littlest bit of yellow there without getting into the blue and ending up with a green in the water. Now I'm going to just readjust my scratch paper and add a little more blue as it comes in towards the beach using that fingertip sponge dauber again. And that also softens that edge where that paper was. You can see by using the ink blending tools, even if you don't like to paint, you can easily create a really colorful scene by using this stamp. Now this is my favorite part actually, is working on the sand here. I'm going to use Toffee Crunch Memento ink, starting off of the edge and working my way on. And I'm going to leave that center portion with some highlight there so you sort of follow that road headed towards the back. Such great perspective already built into the stamp. Now you can start to see some of that lighter colored sand that we stamped and embossed, but watch here when we put on this darker orange blossom color. That lighter sand that's resisting this ink really starts to brighten up with the darker color, and you get that sparkling look to the sand. Now we'll go in and put our work on the sky. So I'm starting with that garden patina, working off the edge and working up to that sunset, taking care not to overlap onto the yellow so we don't get some, we don't want to have any grassy green color up in the sky. Now you can see that this piece that I'm working on is larger than the piece that will be on the actual card, which is really nice. You can start off the edge. If you have any sort of marks there from your sponging, it usually won't be in the part of the card that you use. And the scene is really coming to life now. To enhance that sparkling look in the sand, I'm going to grab even the rich cocoa color and just on the very edges here, put that. And you again can see that lighter stamping really starting to resist that ink and show through and get a nice golden sparkling look to the sand. Now to finish off this card, I stamped and heat embossed a sentiment from this center sentiment here called Destination Sentiments. These are all of the newest sentiments and they all work great, but these ones in the center, the Destination Sentiments, are really an awesome match for this particular Paradise stamp. I added a simple white frame around the outer border of the card and that finished it off. This card is slightly smaller than a 5x7 card. So it's just a little bit bigger size card, but the next one we'll be making is a standard A2 size card. So speaking of the next card, this is going to feature more of a watercolor look, and I also wanted to do a completely different color scheme for this. So here's a look at what we'll be making. Now for this technique, I'll be stamping onto Canson 140-pound watercolor paper, and in choosing my inks, I want to be sure to choose inks and markers that are waterproof or archival because I'm not going to heat emboss on top of this to seal in any of this color. So I want to use these waterproof inks so that when I paint on top, the stamping doesn't start to bleed and blend all over the place. Now for these palm trees, I started by coloring with them with a marker, and because I was stamping onto that textured cardstock, it just wasn't stamping very well. So here's a case where I grabbed my archival ink pad and was able to put down that color around the outer edges of those palm trees and get a really nice crisp impression of all that detail. And then I'll go in with the markers to add the shading. Now the markers that I'm using here are Faber-Castell Design Memory Craft Stampers Big Brush Pens. These are an India ink marker, so when they dry, they are permanent. So that works well with adding the watercolors. They will not bleed and blend when we go to paint the scene. And I'm kind of holding it on the side and feathering that on. And that holding it on the side also allows you to do a little bit larger area when you are coloring onto the stamp. Now with these markers, I do work in small sections before stamping because they are permanent. If you let them dry before you stamp, they're not going to sort of reactivate if you spritz them with water or anything. So you do want to stamp them fairly quickly after you've applied them onto the stamp. You have a little bit of time, but you wouldn't want to wait. Like you wouldn't want to color the whole stamp and then go to stamp it. I did the same thing over here, added that pink archival ink around the outer edges and then adding the shading in here with the purple marker. And all of the exact colors of everything used for each card is in that supply list at the very end of the video on screen. If you are looking for ideas for color schemes for this stamp, if you do a Google search, a Google image search for beach sunset, you will get tons and tons of ideas. I actually just left that up on my computer screen while I was making this and sort of pulled some color ideas from all of the different photos that we're showing. I don't know that if I hadn't seen some pictures with some purples and pinks on the actual palm trees if I would have ever thought to do that, but I love how this turned out. Just working here on the horizon line and adding in some of these details, just like we did with the stamping in the first card, just using a little bit different markers and ink so that we're sure that they are waterproof. And you will see with this textured watercolor paper, it does take sometimes just a couple of impressions to make sure, or a couple of times of inking and stamping it, that it stamps really well. You can also take the marker directly to the paper if you have a spot that you want to just be sure to darken up a little bit. Sometimes that just saves a little bit of time. Here I'll grab some blues for the water area. Kind of mixing some blues and grays. I find I don't have much for cross-contamination of the markers or the inks when I put them over areas that I've already colored and stamped because almost all of that has already transferred to the paper. If you're worried about that, you can clean and dry your stamp in between each impression, but I didn't have any problems with that cross-contaminating onto my ink pads or my markers. So here's an example where looking at some inspiration, just a variety of different inspiration photos had me try something I never would have thought of, to put that sort of purple and gray down onto the sandy areas. But I, again, really love how that turned out, and I think it gives this even more of a mood to the finished piece, and also that it just seems more like nighttime. Here I'm dabbing some darker color onto the center of those palm trees and just fiddling around here. I love to add color and just take my time and add little details here and there. You certainly wouldn't have to go back and keep adding layers, but for me that is fun. And I think that darkening, having a little more contrast up in these trees did just add to the effect of the final card, even though it's pretty subtle. Now to paint this, I'm using my Sakura Koi Field Sketchbox watercolors. You can use whatever watercolor paints that you have on hand and that you like to use. I'm going to start with this sunset, and I am going to put down some yellow and orange and then work my way up to pink. I am using quite a bit of water, especially as I move up into the sky, and that buys me time in order to let those colors mix and blend together. You may want to practice on a piece of scratch paper just to decide which colors that you like and how much water to add before you actually go right onto your scene, especially for this sky. It doesn't take too long to just do a little mixing and practicing. Now I'm trying not to paint over too much of those trees just so I don't get any discoloration where I'm adding the water. A little bit is okay, and the great thing is because we stamped them with the waterproof ink, they're not going to bleed or blend if you get water right up next to them. But I do want to kind of preserve some of the lightness and the white that is in the stamp up there. So I'm moving here now up into the purple color and dropping in more color while all of that is still wet. And a little bit of that blue at the top. Here I'm going to work on the water using that same blue, and then I'll mix in some purple and even a little bit of gray just to tone it down a little. I find with the ink blending cards for these techniques, they are very bold and bright and dynamic, and the watercolor look almost feels kind of vintage, like a vintage postcard. They're both really fun, and they both give you a really different look with the same stamp. And if you do a lot of floral cards or critter cards, or haven't done much with scenic cards, or even if you're a new stamper, these are just like a breath of fresh air to work with. They are really fun, something different, something in the summer to just be playing around, painting, and creating some cards that may have a little bit different look than you're used to. Here you can see I can paint right over those sandy areas while it's still wet, mixing in some grays and some browns. And then I did go ahead and dry that with my heat gun, and now I'm just adding a little bit more here to this pathway on the beach, giving it a bit of a shadow. Now this I did finish off into a standard 4¼ by 5½ inch card. So once that was all dry, I stamped my sentiment and I die cut that using our stitched nested frames over on the left. We also have a new stitched frames called leaf stitched frames, so that would also work great with this, and I've included an image of that there for you on the right. And then my sentiment I stamped again from that destination sentiment set in the center. I love the sentiment. My favorite color is sunset, and that seemed to be the perfect match for this card. So I just stamped that using my MISTI and using sort of a blend of colors that was tone on tone with the sky. Mounted all of this to my note card, and the card was complete. I hope you enjoyed today's video and are inspired to give these scenic stamps a try. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as our website and blog, and I will link all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And here is that supply list as promised for the first card, and the second card is coming right up. Thanks for watching.